What do I need to be good at to be great at something?
Hello, everyone. You are listening to She Leads with Carly, and in this show, we talk to the absolute best, brightest, and yes, badass leaders.
Tap into where your natural curiosity takes you. Just making sure you're not your own roadblock. Even if you do fall, you're going to fall and you're going to learn.
Together, let's build a DNA of what it takes to rise to the top and truly make an impact. I'm your host, Carly Malatsky. Hello, everyone. I am super excited to welcome our guest today, Celine Halioua. Celine is the founder and CEO of Loyal, a biotech startup developing drugs to extend dogs' healthy lifespan. This is a special She Leads because I've actually talked to Celine already on the podcast back in September of 2023, where it was the typical episode style of getting to know her whole story from growing up to both German and Moroccan parents, having a very strong love for animals with about 15 cats, a few dogs, hamsters, I'm sure some more sprinkled in there as well.
Squirrels.
To pivoting from art to neuroscience at the University of Texas and then studying the health economics of gene therapy while attending Oxford for her PhD. There's, of course, much more to that afterwards that ultimately led her to founding Loyal. Definitely go take a listen to that episode to hear how Celine's past led to where she is today. She gives some pretty bold statements that, of course, inform a lot of her life lessons and philosophies as well. But in today's chat, we are going to talk about where Loyal is today and what the last year and a half have been like and what it means to start a deep tech company. Loyal has raised approximately $150 million and has recently crossed off another major milestone by receiving the second ever efficacy approval for a longevity drug, this time for Loy2, a chewable for senior dogs of almost any size, whereas Loyal's first drug is Loy1, which is used to extend large dog lifespan. Celine, I'm so excited to have you back on the podcast today. Welcome back.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Of course. So I know I gave a little bit of an intro about essentially where Loyal is today, but I actually want to hear from you. Can you give me a little bit of this overview? What do you guys look like today? And has the mission changed at all since founding? What is the mission?
The mission is to get the first drug FDA-approved for lifespan extension and help dogs live a longer, healthier life. And that has been the mission since day zero, since day negative 365. It's really always been what we've been working on. Obviously, the details have evolved and changed as we've done the science, right? But no, and we're getting really close. So as of today, we are about a year out from hopefully bringing to market the first dog longevity drug. A lot of work to do between now and then, but I think we can pretty safely say we've done more of the work than lies ahead of us.
It's insane, by the way. And I want to know, can you even actually give me a high-level overview of the stakeholders involved? Because when it comes to a drug company, I know you have pharma, you have regulators, you have, in this case, you have the vets. Like, who are the stakeholders and who is ultimately like the end consumer, I guess, before the dog, if you will? Is it the vet or the parent?
So the end consumer, the person who buys the drug in the end is the dog owner. It's the pet parent, right? Obviously, the dog literally and figuratively is the consumer of the drug. But it's also very important to have the veterinarian buy-in. So it is a prescription product. You're not going to be able to buy it on the shelves of Target. It's not a supplement. This is an FDA or will be an FDA-approved drug. And so that means that a registered veterinarian will have to decide that it's in the best interest of your dog and on-label use and all of that before you can get it. So it's very important that they are armed with the knowledge and the context to make that decision for the patient in front of them, which is difficult for any drug. It's especially difficult when you're doing something that's first in class. This is going to be the first drug that they potentially stock in their clinics whose only use case is to keep your relatively healthy dog healthy longer. Every other drug they're used to is going to be for osteoarthritis pain or for preventing heartworm or flea and ticks or cancer or what have you. It's a very different use case. And then, of course, there's the regulators. The Food and Drug Administration, which regulates all human drugs, also regulates dog drugs. And it's actually a really common misconception that we went down this path because it's less regulated. It's actually not true at all. The veterinary FDA holds everything to an extremely high standard, but you can just see it takes a shorter period of time because you can see the benefit in a shorter period of time because dogs live a shorter life than humans. So to see a dog's lifespan extension takes about 5 years versus in a human, it would probably take 10 to 15 years at minimum.
And so if anything, you still actually go through the rigorous process, but if anything, probably the approval process is a little bit shorter because the studies can be completed in a short amount of time.
Yes.
Okay, amazing. And so given that ultimately like the vets are making that decision for their patients, do you spend a lot of time right now educating veterinarians? Like, is that a part of the process currently, or have you not really reached that commercial phase yet?
Oh, we've been doing that for years. We write a lot of papers. So we have a whole veterinarian clinical team at Loyal. And I'm not the one who's going out educating veterinarians about their specialty, right? No veterinarian wants to hear from me. They're hearing from peers on canine geriatric syndrome and different types of aging in dogs and the biology and how it's relevant to their practice today and what's going to change in the future and how does this fit into the needs that their clients and their clinic may have and how do they understand the biology and all of these things. And it's a very internally vet-led process at the organization to do that well. So we attend conferences all over the US. We go to vet clinics all over the US. We spend a lot of time understanding veterinarian needs, one, and two, educating them on what we're doing.
So I mentioned in the intro how you now have Loy 2 and Loy 1, which is what you started with, the original drug. I think you actually even have a third one. Is that right?
We have a Loy 3. We're also working on another drug, which we have not publicly named yet, but I can confirm that it is not called Loy 4.
I was going to be like, I think I can guess. So I actually want to talk about that like strategical decision to do that, because if anything, you've actually talked a lot about this of going, focusing on one drug, which a lot of people advise to do that versus making it almost this multi-product company. Can you walk me through that decision of what ultimately led to saying, okay, we need to build another drug?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. Classically, in both software and in biotech, you really focus on your lead product. The value is determined by the lead product. And when I started Loyal, I was pretty quick. So in 2020, when I started the company, we pretty immediately landed on Loy 1. And that same year, we started working on Loy 2. And this was actually a big debate at the organization, right? Because it's split focus, split money. We had only raised like $5 million at the time. Right? It's ridiculous to double the costs that we need to do when we're so early to getting a drug to market. And the fundamental thesis was that I knew, even in the first days of Loyal, that our thesis was correct, that a drug could extend a dog's healthy lifespan, and that if you did this, that people would want it. So then the question became, okay, how many shots on goal can we have? Because the problem with doing science is that you can't control the science, right? Loy 1, Loy 2, Loy 3, Loy whatever, any drug that we pick, it is predetermined whether that drug is or is not going to extend the lifespan of a dog. There is nothing I can do to change that fundamental biology. All I can do is have the best team possible and do the most rigorous science to pick which drug Loy 1, Loy 2, Loy 3 are, or kill it quickly if we realize it's not going to work, right? But there's always that extrinsic existential risk that is completely uncontrollable, right? Because there's unknown unknowns. And so I didn't want Loyal's very valid thesis, a very valid core bet the drug can be approved for lifespan extension, that people will want it, and they can extend a dog's lifespan, to get marred by the fact that we happen to pick a drug that didn't work, right? Or a drug that wasn't safe, or a drug that you couldn't formulate. And so, yeah, it was a pretty big bet. It certainly has increased our burn. It's very expensive to develop, now 3 drugs at once. But I'm so glad we did it because otherwise, we would have not had the resilience that we've had since day one. We're not emotionally attached to any one drug. We're only emotionally attached to getting a drug approved for lifespan extension.
Yeah. So if anything, it's also just like from a pitch perspective, right? Whether it's to investors or whatnot. At the end of the day, you're saying we are going to solve this problem. It may be a range of different solutions, but we'll get there. So like that's like the premise, if you will.
Yep.
And did that require hiring a whole new, team of scientists, or were you able to almost like still make, far progress even with the resources that you had?
We actually were, because science is it's like sprints and then waiting, right? So you sprint to set up a study, and especially in a longevity drug, the studies are really long. So there's a ton of work into designing a study, the protocol development, the ethics review, setting it up, like all of that, right? And then the study's running. And there's work to be done while the study's running, don't get me wrong, but it's not as much work as previously. And assuming you did your study design well, you're going to use that same study design over and over and over and over again. So suddenly the amount of work, the incremental work is much lower. And you can kind of Tetris things in that while one thing is running in maybe at 10% usage, bandwidth usage, you can then layer on, okay, we're going to do the 50% bandwidth usage for the second drug right there, right? And we're going to take the learnings and iterate there. And so you can be pretty clever with it if you use a parallelization strategy.
That's brilliant. And you said it's actually uncommon for biotech companies. Why is it then uncommon? Because that makes sense to me, to almost like take that, design study and whatnot.
Well, it depends on the era of biotech you're looking at. So there's kind of like two categories of biotech startups classically, right? There's a single asset, which is we have this drug, we think it works. Here's all the reasons why we think it works. Fund us. If we're correct, we're going to flip it, sell it, whatever at the end of this clinical study. And then there's the platforms, which are like Moderna is like the classic example. We're developing mRNA. We figured it out. We have the team, and like every application of mRNA we're going to like develop, and we're going to multiply it out. Generally speaking, platform does better in a kind of more capital abundant world because you're building for something that is, it has the ability to be a multi-billion-dollar organization. It has resilience, but it also has much higher capital needs. Versus in a more contractile market, which we have been in the last few years, drug companies get valued off of their lead asset. So even if you are developing multiple drugs, which many biotech companies are developing multiple drugs, it's not that they're only doing one. In the end, your value on the markets is usually largely determined by that asset. And if that lead asset fails, your value goes down. Now, you still might survive, right? And you have something else in the back end, but it's like this really difficult balancing act of like, you don't want to over dilute. You don't want to raise ridiculous amounts of sums. You need to put all the money you can until your lead asset is succeeding. But then also, you don't want your company to be dead if that lead asset doesn't work. But you also don't want to overspend on the platform because the platform doesn't really matter until you validate that it's valuable. And the only way to validate your platform is valuable is to bring a drug to market. So it's like kind of this chicken and egg situation that is made so much worse than human health because it's literally an order of magnitude more expensive to develop a human drug than it is to develop a dog drug.
Interesting. And it seems like where you are today, too, that LOI-2 is actually doing very well. Even, is it better? It's performing better than LOI-1, or is it almost entirely different?
Well, so the biology is very different, but it is performing better in terms of timeline. And that's because the manufacturing is simpler. The manufacturing of a cheap, cash pay accessible, safe, long shelf life, replicable, blah, 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 injectable is very difficult. And manufacturing a pill is also difficult, but it is not that difficult.
Got it. So I want to talk a bit about, and I want to spend some time on your fundraising journey, okay? Because you've talked about this, but tell me a little bit. It seems like almost a roller coaster that you've kind of been through where at one phase, tell me a little bit about that, like zero interest rate period where money was essentially flying around. It was probably easier to raise. And then that drastically changed. And you were in a position where you actually needed to raise, but you couldn't. Can you walk me through that process and then obviously what ultimately led to your Series B and B2?
Yeah. So, one of the interesting things about us is, and most deep tech companies is, we're not making revenue. We only burn money, right? Our value is ascribed not to, we're having this growth rate with this low churn and this low CAC and blah, blah, blah. It's increasing probability of success of reaching a finish line. And that finish line is considered generally objectively valuable. So for us, if we get this drug approved, there's some not clever people who think that this will be a very successful drug. But on average, it is pretty consensus that people understand that vets and dog owners are going to want this and that it's going to support a lot of sales. The question isn't that. The question is, can you bring this to market? Can we get this approved? It's all the technical risk, right? So our value or valuation valuation is not a perfect science, but at a high level for us, it's ascribed to our probability of success. It's just a discount on that final valuation at approval. That is very different from, a revenue-based company. one of the challenges we've had is, so when in the early days of Loyal, let's call it like the first 2 years, we're in the pre-beginning of, it was already pretty frothy era, and then ZERP happened because of COVID, and that just went like through the roof. Loyal has never been a super consensus company, so we never had like the massive SoftBank $1 billion round, right? And at the time, I remember being really annoyed about that, and I was like, what the hell, guys? Really glad it didn't happen. But we were able to raise money, I think, more easily than we should have been able to, given how rigorous my understanding of the milestones and the risk unlocks were at the time. I kind of was always going out with this big vision story. We have this drug, we're going to extend dog lifespan, and then we're going to take that and extend human lifespan. Ta-da! Underselling it a little bit, but compared to how rigorously we think about where every dollar goes and what we're spending on and why we're spending on it and what it unlocks and what that looks like and what's the risks and how are we going to de-risk them, right? Like that rigor didn't exist at the Series C, Series A stage. Then the market nuked, basically. I tried to raise a Series B I always get the years confused, but basically the worst quarter, Q4 of 2022, which ended up being like the worst quarter for growth in like recent memory, and could not raise flat to my Series A, couldn't get any money at all.
And by the way, at this time, were you like, how many, if you remember, like what was your runway? Like, was it already at a stressful period where you kind of went at a point where we need money, or did you expect and anticipate this coming and you were like, okay, let's start this early?
Well, I didn't anticipate it coming, but one of our investors anticipated it coming because he'd seen this story before with 2008 and the dot-com crash. So he'd actually called me before everything started going to shit and was like, Celine, you need to take more money. So thankfully, we had taken $20 million from family offices and high net worths earlier that year. So we went out to raise because we wanted to raise a Series B, but we were actually in a pretty good spot, relatively speaking.
Got it. And what made you even go to family offices? That's like also, it was kind of off the path, right? Like when you're in Silicon Valley, you see the investors, the top VC funds. Like, was there something that pushed you to say, okay, maybe we should kind of look outside of the standard?
Well, so there's a pre and a post. So during ZERP, there was a lot of people, especially crypto money, putting money into other things. Like crypto was especially relevant for Loyal because of longevity, but also just generally, like people weren't making money in, like the interest-based ways. Like they basically were high risk, right? They were risk on to put their money because you're not going to make a lot of money in a bond or whatever. And so then they were going, and that's why they were investing so much in venture funds and private assets and SPACs and all this stuff that, again, we all know the story of how that ended up. That's why it's called a zero interest rate phenomena. So that was one capital pool. The post-ZERP implosion was on paper the same pool. It was high net worth individuals, in some cases random people with a lot of money. And that was more because Loyal is a good investment, I believe, our investors believe. And even if you're not motivated about making money, Loyal is a great, like, if you care about what we're doing, I kind of think of it as like philanthropy with a venture return. You're funding science, you're funding helping dogs, you're funding something that actually matters that people want to talk about. So I don't think that strategy would have worked if we were a B2B SaaS company, even if there was some like great story of making money. People took the meeting because they're like, we love dogs, we're interested in longevity, we're interested in aging, want to support, young female founders, whatever it was. There were different hooks that made us interesting that meant we were able to raise. And so it was a very different feeling. Like the 20 million, I think, took, God, not long, less than a month, versus the 7 million post-ZERP took 6 months, maybe more. And we were much more like cash constrained, like very, very careful about where we were putting our dollars when and for what, and capital unlocks and all of that. But I learned a lot from that. I learned much more from that latter fundraise than I did from the former fundraise.
What were some of those? Because I think you're right. When you have constraint and you're forced to almost be very disciplined of how you're spending and honestly in other things as well, what were some of those lessons that you learned that you probably weren't able to when things are going well?
It was just understanding the rigor with which you need to run an organization. And also not getting too rigorous because you need to open yourself up to serendipity. And that's always the balance. So like, for example, like so painful every time I think about this. I'm cringing, which is why I'm going to tell this story. I remember we were hiring for some not crucial role and we had 2 final candidates that we liked. And the hiring manager was like, why don't we hire both? And I said yes. which is like crazy town. Like I would literally never say yes to that now. Like you have to like pull my teeth to get me to green light any higher. I really have to understand, why do we need this person? What happens if we don't have this person? Like what's the downsides? But it was just like at that time, like everyone was like, build, hire, go, grow, grow, grow. And I didn't know anything different. And so it was just the degree of rigor was that you really had to understand, what is everybody doing? Why are they doing it? Why does it matter? Do we need to have it now? Do we need to have it later? Are we really, prioritization is a huge thing. When you have constraint, you have to prioritize and you have to understand why you're doing something. And you can't just go and be like, well, we're not going to do anything, or we're not going to do this thing. You don't want to be penny wise, pound foolish, which is a huge thing in drug because the feedback loops are so long. And like we use this like capital-based unlocking system. So like we had a waterfall basically for every dollar that I raised, where would it go first? So the first $3 million went to runway extension. Then the next 5 went to Lloyd 3 manufacturing, and the next 2 went to the stay study, and whatever it was, right? We had this whole thing. And we still do that today, even though we have plenty of money in the bank, because it's a great way to run the organization. And it's much more pleasant than when it was at that time when everything was very tight. But it was a great learning.
Has this made you, do you have strong opinions about, say you were to start from ground zero, and whether it's a software company or a deep tech, biotech, do you actually have a different philosophy now that you've seen the benefits of being a bit constrained?
Yeah. I mean, I would still probably, if I could raise the money, I still would raise. I mean, I don't know about software, but like for deep tech, right? Because you never know what you don't know. Like I had our timelines totally wrong when I started Loyal. Like we've had delays that we didn't expect. We had delays we expected. We've had delays that were out of left field. Like you always want to have capital, but you have to understand the other side of the coin to have the discipline to say no. It is really difficult when you have, like right now, we have the money in the bank and I'm still like, you really got to justify it as higher to me.
Totally. And even, it's funny because, and I've seen this with like other founders, even if they seem, or, they are very like disciplined people, it's very different of saying like, I'm going to spend this very, in a very disciplined way. Because like you said, like something can come up and you can be convinced, or, so you almost forced to have these like focus mindset on.
Yeah, and it's hard, right? Because you get people who are annoyed. They're asking you to hire things when you don't understand the role entirely. So it's difficult to make a convicted bet. And also, sometimes it's much more expensive to not hire the person.
Through that whole journey, and right, like at the end of the day, yes, we're talking about it retrospectively, like hindsight 2020, if you will. But during those times, I mean, it's much harder to do rather than like to actually continue to have a healthy, mentality around it all. How did you kind of get through it? Was there, mentors that were kind of supporting you? Did you do your own personal thing to kind of stay afloat, if you will, during this time? Or was it actually pretty scary? How did you navigate it?
I don't know. I've always had complete conviction in Loyal being right and us succeeding. And so I was exhausted because I was doing like, I don't know how many meetings I took to get the eventual 7 million, but I was doing like crazy shit. One of the groups I was talking to who ended up investing, we'd been talking for months, and then I find out he's going to be in the Hamptons. And I was like, oh, I'm nearby.
Not nearby at all.
No, I'm not nearby. And I've never been to the Hamptons. I don't know how to get there. I end up taking an Uber, a ridiculously expensive Uber, and staying in the cheapest hotel so I can meet him in the morning, which seems like a fine deal, except for the fact that there's no signal in portions of the Hamptons. So I then wake up in the morning, have zero signal, didn't have the Wi-Fi code because this hotel is so ratchet that there wasn't like a front desk person. It was basically like they leave a key under a mat and you like unlock the door and you get in, and couldn't call an Uber to go meet this guy wherever I was going to meet him. So I ended up walking down the street of like this random middle of nowhere. I really have no idea where I was, to go and like get a bar of signal so I could finally call an Uber and make it to this meeting. And he ended up investing actually like quite a bit into the organization. We're like really good friends now and it's all great. But like for every one of those where like we ended up building relationship, have friendship, and them investing in Loyal, there was like 20 where they didn't do it. I was doing this like ridiculous shit. And it was like kind of funny. Like, and it sounds, like, oh, it's just the Hamptons, it's fine. But like, it was a racket, right? It was not glamorous. There was nothing glamorous about any of these situations. It was like sleeping on like a metal framed bed and living off of protein bars, flying economy everywhere, and like being jet lagged and sick constantly.
By the way, when he said he was in the Hamptons, were you in the Bay Area or where were you?
I think I had planned. I mean, I live in the Bay Area, so I probably flew to New York. But the getting to New York thing, not that bad. The getting to New York from Hamptons, very bad.
I think what I love about even like both of those stories, right, is like if anything, you're showing the true like behind the scenes. Because I think if, we hear so much the narrative, like they just raised this huge round and they just raised this huge round, and you don't really know what goes on behind the scenes. And it also reminds me, there's this quote that you actually said, there's a lot of money in this world, and if you're willing to put in the ungodly hours, you can always raise the capital you need. And does that still hold true?
It holds more true.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, I always knew it was going to happen. I always knew it was going to be possible. It was just getting the right connections to the right people, the right luck, like saying the right thing at the right time, not messing up, like all of these little things. But I think one of the biggest learnings for me is it literally only works if you truly, truly believe in what you're building and that it's worthwhile. I can't sell shit, right? I'm not a good salesperson. I just believe in loyal. And I believe all of the facts and the theses and the bets are on our side. So it's just kind of getting somebody to pay attention long enough.
So one philosophy of yours is this concept of radical transparency, and especially to your investors, the board, which people try to buy into is probably what I would see from the outside, but it's actually hard in action. Can you talk me through this process? And was it a very intentional thing where you were like, I'm going to share the good, the bad, the ugly with investors? And why was that important for a company like Loyal?
Yeah, so it was intentional. I'd say one of like it's obviously difficult because of you kind of like make a lot of mistakes if you're building a company, especially if you're a first-time founder. It's also difficult though because it takes a lot of time and effort to like remember who have you told what, how have you communicated it, what context do they have, when you're going to tell them what, when, like holding yourself. It's actually so difficult. I do it for two reasons. Actually, three reasons. One is forcing the like learning cycles. Like if I hire the wrong person, make some mistake, whatever it is, having the candor about it means it forces me to face it, and it forces me to not do it again. Or at least with my personality type, I'm not going to do it again. I'll make new mistakes. I make new mistakes all the time, but I won't make the same mistake. And the probability goes down if I'm candid about it with someone. So that's one. Two, I do it because I'm a solo founder. And so I think it's really important to have an external party that isn't being paid by me, right? Everybody at the team's on my payroll, ultimately, who, knows the good, bad, and the ugly to hold me accountable. Because I don't think I'm of the personality to become one of those like walk on water, narcissistic CEOs. But I don't know I don't know if any of the CEOs who behave that way thought they were the personality to do that. And so I really want to have like that external accountability and not just have like a bunch of yes men and yes women around me. And I know the investors will do it, especially the personalities I have around the table. And then three, and finally, what we're working on is really technical, really difficult. And no matter how candid I am, there's a lot of micro decisions we're making all the time that you have to trust me and my team on that are going to have a huge implication on Loyal and it's our ultimate outcome. And so I just think being more transparent about, we heard this from the FDA, this went right, this went wrong, these are the milestones, here's when we'll know this, here's when we'll know that. It's kind of over communication. It's probably a bit annoying, honestly, but I think it's helpful because then they know like, oh, Celine's going to follow up on this date, whether this study went well or badly, and this is what it means.
And I imagine from the investor perspective, it is very well received. Like, yes, it could be annoying. Sure, they're, getting inundated with messages from you, but I think at the end of the day, they want to know more than less.
Maybe. I think maybe it is. I think it is more now. I think in early days, a lot of people are not as... So, like, one example is, like, hiring. Most people, especially first-time founders, are not great at hiring, and I was certainly no exception. I made a lot of hiring mistakes in the early days. And also, even if you're great at it, at a certain point for certain levels, the probability, like, the success rate is just low. And I was always super candid about when I hired somebody and it didn't work out. Now, on its face, that's theoretically should be happening at all of their early stage companies. If it's not happening, they probably should be concerned because like if this founder's not moving and like there's no way to have 100% or 90 or 80% hit rate. Realistically, if the only CEO they're hearing from is me being like, oh, I fucked it up again. Oh, wrong person again. Sorry, guys. Oh no, you know the story. It does create this like, oh, what's going on here, right? I think a lot of founders are really good at putting a sheen and a spin on everything, and I'm both not good at that and don't do it. So I think it was net positive for the organization, 1,000%. I don't regret it, and I'm pretty sure some people thought I was like not very competent for a while.
No, but I mean, look, that's also the realities of first-time founding. Like you said, like there are always mistakes that you make and happen, and hiring is probably a really good, example. And on that lens, actually, with hiring, I read something really interesting where a lot of biotech companies started by PhDs fail because they're so emotionally attached to that very narrow problem. And so, can you talk a little bit about that? Is that something where you hired PhDs that were very tied to this problem and it was a little hard to actually shift or change the route, if you will? Or do you actually recognize that from the beginning and this is something that you kind of carry with your hiring philosophy?
I would say we don't have this problem. I think this is more of like the academic founder paradox, where I had the initial thesis and insight for Loyal, right? This idea of a drug to extend a dog lifespan, starting with big dog, short lifespan. And I came from a gene therapy lab at Oxford. So I was like, oh, gene therapy, hammer nail. But I thankfully I'm scientifically trained, and my press team always gets mad at me when I say this, but I don't consider myself a scientist. And so I'm not like particularly emotionally attached, nor have any ego about my scientific hypotheses. I have the ego about the thesis, right? I drug to extend dog lifespan, but even if we had not gone down big dog short lifespan, I would have been fine with that too. I think it's much more different when you actually are like a fully fledged trained scientist who has spent decades becoming an expert in this one little niche area of protein biology as relevant to whatever cancer, right? You're going to end up starting a company at space. That's where you have the insight. And I mean, again, it's going to be different, but on average, it's been pretty difficult to do that and then acknowledge, later on that like this thesis is incorrect, or maybe this pathway isn't as strong as this other pathway that you didn't dedicate your life to, but it's also, existing and interesting. People specialize with time. And in science, you specialize pretty early, and it's because of how difficult it is to get the context. You don't often specialize in lots of things. There's a root truth in science that you're learning and catching up on. It's not like specializing in engineering and then customer support and then this and then that, right? Because these are all different fields, and it's really more people than it is like foundational physical sciences.
Would you say that statement where you said, there's no ego attached, and if anything, you're prepared for your assumptions to be proven wrong? Has that always been a characteristic of you? Or were you ever, and this may sound weird, but were you ever almost like humbled to be like, okay, I have to remove myself out of the equation, and how did that process, what did that look like for you?
I mean, when I first came to the Valley, that was the biggest thing, like working here and always having been like the smart one and actually dumbing myself down and then being around these groups and not being like even in the top like 50% of intelligence, thinking ability, rigor. Also, I'm obviously intelligent, but I think I'm intelligent in a different way, right? I mean, you're not going to sit here and solve math equations for fun or do AI proofs or whatever, right? Like that's not my form of intelligence. Mine is more like clever and like connecting dots and all of that. And yeah, it was super, super humbling. And I think it was like, okay, well, how much do I care about being a big fish in a small pond or being a big fish in general, in which case go back to the small pond? Or do I care about, creating the future that I want? And I care more about creating the future that I believe should exist. And so then it was like kind of an ego death. It was like really terrible, actually. I remember like sobbing every time I would go to a networking thing because I felt so self-conscious for like a year plus. But then I fucking got over it. And now I'm like, I don't care if I look stupid. I don't care if I ask a dumb question. It's just like there's like a cool confidence that you get once you realize that you don't have to attach your ego to being right or being the smartest person in the room.
I love that. Okay, given you've been in the Bay Area now and you've seen the shift, we actually talked about this, I remember now, where you had this like really interesting observation where people in the Bay lead with intelligence or ideas, at least. And that was like a really fascinating kind of shift for you. But I think on the downside, have you also seen where, and I talk about this a lot, where like founding is very sexy in the Bay Area and, Stanford's right around the corner, all of this stuff. Do you think that there's too many founders who are almost too ego tied and not, die hard mission driven versus, like what you said? How do you kind of see when you go and meet new founders or networking events?
Well, I think there's different types of founders, and it's hard for me to understand the other type because I'm never going to be that type. But there's a type who just like want to work on an interesting problem and build a really big business and like scale something, and it's kind of like the art of the deal or the sport or whatever of like building an organization. And I get that. Like I love organization building now, actually. I find it like very interesting. And I love like how like I don't spend my time really on science anymore. I spend my time on facilitating science, but that's a very different game than like actually thinking about scientific principles. So I totally get that. I would never be that type of founder, and I would certainly not be motivated if I was that type of founder because it tends to be like pretty terrible. I think I really like the deep tech crowd that has become kind of in vogue in the last few years because they all tend to be hardcore missionary folks, right? They're all about creating a future. They see a problem in the world. They want to take it on. It's atoms. It's difficult. It's technical. They often like are building off of skill sets or they themselves don't come from like, they weren't bred to be a founder. They had an insight and, foundering was the best tool or vehicle to do the change they wanted. And that's certainly AI, I think actually has a lot of that too. Obviously there's like the wrapper companies, which is a little bit different, but like the like core, like foundational AI is a lot like that too. I like those types of companies more, but I also get why some people would be more just about the spirit of building.
But it makes sense. I mean, even like you said, the deep tech folks, like that makes sense to me based off of how you described even fundraising as a deep tech company, right? Like it's not necessarily those revenue generating, like you can't show that because you don't have that yet. So it has to be almost rooted in the mission. So that like there's alignment there. So you mentioned organizational building, which I would love to talk about because I imagine in the last, year and a half, 2 years, that has been probably a big focus as you've continued to scale and grow as a company. How have you approached that? What does building a culture look like to you and where did you learn to do it?
I mean, I think I've learned it on the job. But I would say the values that we hold are all just really my values. I mean, we did it with the team too, but like realistically, they're my values.
Yeah. And so even talk about that, right? Like were those values you've had since for years and years? Was it something that you were like, okay, I need to be let's go to a whiteboard right now and brainstorm what are my values? How did you go about that?
It kind of was just obvious. It's so like one of our values is opportunities at the intersection. And this has kind of always been my thesis for my career. When I was an undergrad, I worked in a nanobiotechnology lab and a neurotechnology lab. And, I'm not going to pretend like I was a star researcher in either lab. I was fine, but I wasn't, going to get a Nobel Prize. But where I did find opportunity was at the intersections of fields. So bringing a relatively low-hanging fruit from the nanobiotechnology side and bringing it over to the neurobiology side and finding an application for the nano stuff in the neuro stuff where the neuro people would have never understood or learned about the nano stuff, and the nano people didn't have the skill sets to understand the biological implications of what they were working on. And so that opportunity was at the intersection, that kind of like new low-hanging fruit that was only possible if you had context for two disparate fields, which I also think is loyal, right? It's aging biology, it's canine medicine, it's consumer bias. So that's one of our values. Expertise without ego, just being chill and not playing titles, and the smartest, the loudest voice being the one who has the most context, not the highest title. Leading with context, helping the team understand why we're doing what we're doing and treating them like the intelligent people they are and not just saying do this, right? And it actually being a better way to build an organization because they understand the intentions and they can fit into the intentions. Leaning into moonshots. I mean, Loyal's literally a moonshot. Like that was always it. It's really the more difficult bit is the execution and the edge cases. So like transparency is great. I care about transparency a lot. And leading with context is great. And it takes a lot more effort to lead your team with context versus be like, do this now. And it's very tough to just be like, do this now. Like, stop fucking asking questions. I have 50 other things to do. Just do it. So that's much harder. Or the edge cases of like one of our values is empathy and respect for all life. And that is great. And it drives a lot of things. And I'm sure there are ex team members who hate me and are mad at me because I had to let them go. And how do you think about that? Because you can't optimize for the individual's happiness at an organization. You have to optimize for what's best for the whole organization, which has a huge macro good. There's like a utilitarian aspect here of like, how do you do the right thing for people when you're working on something this big? And so the devil's all in the details of doing this stuff and doing it well. But I think really more to learn it, I've always had these core values, at least as an adult. And it's been more how do you execute on it and what are the little edge cases and how, that's where you kind of find yourself and understand where the lines are.
And you mentioned, and we even talked about this, but about the ego portion, one thing that you've been very vocal about is, at least in our first episode, right? But when you were at Oxford and like all of these programs, hierarchy was a huge thing. If anything, everything was built on hierarchy, but it was almost like, to be very candid, it was bullshit. You know, it didn't necessarily warrant hierarchy. Do you still buy into that? Like, is that still something that you now carry with you in Loyal and who you hire? Do you try tests for that people, leave their ego at the door?
Yeah, I mean, one simple way to do it is just, and I do this a lot of interviews, is just asking people what mistakes they've made. And you would not believe how many people will not admit to a mistake they made. And I'm like, there is no way you've been at this organization for 5 years and not made a mistake. And I'm like, oh, here's one mistake. And it's like really somebody else's mistake.
Like in my mind, when I hear that question, I can imagine people being like, okay, well, I'm trying to get this job. I don't want to give. It's like the weaknesses question, where you try kind of go around it. Is that something where you're like, okay, is there like I don't know. Does that come into it when you test for that?
I don't think there's one right way to answer it. I think what I am looking for and what I really like in team members is extreme candor. We all make mistakes. I've made plenty of mistakes. They're going to make mistakes. I know we're going to make mistakes. But when you're running a really technical team, and especially running a technical team where I don't have the technical expertise, nobody has all the technical expertise with the others, right? I'm not an engineer. I'm not a formulator. I'm not a whatever, right? I need to know that that person is going to be ridiculously forthcoming about something going wrong, even if they know that if they don't tell me, I'll never know about it. And just like that radical accountability is so crucial. It's also crucial because it's the only trait, low ego and radical accountability are the only traits I've seen that are somewhat predictive of somebody's ability to scale with the organization, right? Because it's really, really easy. Like, I think another word for this is high agency, where you're like, yes, you can always blame everyone else around you all the time. And you can come up with like the most, strong justification of why everything would have been successful of like these 5 people didn't screw you over. But realistically, you can control everything, right? And everything's in your control. And if you can think about it in that way, then you'll think about these mistakes, even if it's not really a mistake, or if the process wasn't bad, if it had a bad outcome, you'll think about it that way. You'll take that radical accountability and you're going to change it and figure it out the next time. And that's what I really hire for. And it's a pretty rare skill set because in a lot of places, in a lot of like worlds, it's not culturally rewarded, one, right? Like kind of like you say, you're rewarded for having a sheen.
I love that. That's something that's so tangible that I can take with me or, like even for other founders too. I think that's brilliant. I want to know something I actually asked you a year and a half ago is what success looks like for you and how has that changed? And I would love for you to answer today, what does success look like, both for Loyal, but also like as Celine, a founder?
I think there's different forms of success. So I think I would say, we hit a decent tranche of success with the efficacy approvals because it proved that the science is valid. But also, I think more importantly to me, it proved that there's a regulatory path for a lifespan extension drug. Now, that's not sufficient success by any means, but I would say it was like the first, okay, there's like some percentage success achieved towards the vision. And the next big one is going to be getting FDA approval and bringing to market the first longevity drug. It's going to be massive. I don't know if there's like a deterministic, yes, we've hit 100% success, no more to do. But I would say after the efficacy approval, then it would be showing this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, which is, good for the success of Loyal, also important for driving interest in the space more broadly and driving science in this space because the science will follow the money. And then the next level of success would be successfully taking what we do in dogs into humans, maybe in intermediaries like building an animal pharma. So they're all different levels of success. I want to say I'd be happy if we just build a dog longevity company. That's probably not the case. I'm probably not going to be that happy if we only do that. But it is obviously successful to do that.
Yeah. No, I love it. Okay, Celine, what craft are you spending a lifetime honing?
Horseback riding.
Wow, you've said the same. That's amazing. Is this something that is this almost like a thing that you do for like just mental health that you enjoy doing? Or did you grow up riding?
Yeah, my family in Germany rode. Everybody in Germany rides. And I had like an off-the-track thoroughbred when I was a kid.
So do you go riding in the bay? Like, I'm sure it's actually beautiful there. Yeah.
I go riding multiple times a week. I was riding this morning.
That's like your sanity, away from Loyal, because you probably think about, Loyal all the other hours of the day.
It's that. It's also more that it's a flow state. I don't really hit flow states anymore because I'm call to call to call to call to call. I'm in a reactive state, not a flow state. Horseback riding is very much a flow state.
Which, if I remember correctly, that was even like a philosophy you had of building Loyal, or of how we develop drugs. If anything is very reactive, and you were like, how can we be more proactive? Maybe that was a stretch, but like that's actually what came to mind when you said that. All right, Celine, I am so excited for you. It's been so fun to catch up and just hear the last, year and a half, if you will. Where is the best place? Where can people find you? Where can people learn more about Loyal? How can they find you?
I think since we last chatted, we got the domain. So we're now at loyal.com. And then theoretically, my website, CelineHH.com, although I haven't updated it in a while.
Thank you so much for listening to the show this week. If you enjoyed, please spread the word. Tell someone about She Leads or post about it on social media and tag us. If you want to contact us, feel free to send over a message through the She Leads Instagram page at sheleads.show. If you want to follow us on Twitter, our account is @SheLeadsShow, and mine is @CarlyMalatsky. Thanks again.